I'm really particularly pleased that there are Native Americans present with us today, and I'm deeply conscious that the Lummi Nation arrived on this land the same time that Abraham was entering the Ur of the Chaldees, which was thousands of years ago, and that about 500 years ago, people from Europe and Asia settled here. And so the theme of reconciliation and healing between cultures, between people, is part of the address I want to give today. And I'm so pleased when Rudd said that Native Americans, the indigenous people, will have the first opportunity to respond. I'm not here to speak for them, of course. I'm here to tell a story from an opportunity I've been given living when working with Native Canadians. When I was a teenager, and for 8 years of my high school and college years, I was a hunting and fishing guide in northern British Columbia. And of course, the people who I worked with were the Carrier Nation. And so for 8 summers, I lived and worked with the indigenous people. And then when I was elected Bishop of Caribou, a fifth of the people in the diocese where I was called to serve were Native Canadians. And so it's part of that journey that I want to talk about as part of a story. Reconciliation and healing is a lifelong process. And I'm just going to give a little snippet as part of it from a more personal point of view. You can't deal with reconciliation and healing until there is an acknowledgement that there is pain and there is suffering, and it took place. So let me start right off the top. Abuse took place in Canadian government-owned and church-run residential schools. That abuse was physical, it was mental, it was sexual, it was cultural. It took place. That's the reality. But when pain and suffering is acknowledged, when it's named, and you lean towards the pain, then there's the possibility of healing. But anybody who's been in a family where some beloved person has died, you've noticed how different people in the family handle that process differently. Well, the same thing happens when nations of, and there's not Native Canadians, there's many nations of Indigenous Canadians and many different members of different churches. And we're all at different places on this journey of healing. And so I'm just giving just a tiny snippet from my own particular point of view. I want to read something that United States, so I have to use the word president. The Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, said in 1968. He said, "I think all of us feel a sense of guilt, not so much towards the natives as towards the fact that we really have not set our minds to address this problem." Guilt. You know, there's good guilt and bad guilt. Bad guilt, pseudo-guilt, is the kind you have because I'm not a perfect husband, perfect father, grandfather, teacher, you know what I mean. That's called pseudo-guilt. Waste of time. But real guilt, good guilt, is when we have done something wrong and we should damn well feel guilty about it. Well, there's a sense of guilt about the way that we settlers entered into Canada and how we just assumed that we could just take over. I'm embarrassed by the journals of one of my predecessors. In his journal, he wrote, "We came to convert the savages and bring them to a true religion and to a true empire." I'm embarrassed. I'm moving beyond shame. But I'm guilty, and I might as well own it. I'm guilty. I'm part of that heritage. Now, no point wallowing. One way you don't become a responsible citizen is by self-pity or blaming. No self-pity, no blame, just reality. Face the facts. Lean towards the pain. Do something. And do it together, even when it hurts. And I see over the period of time that I've been involved in these things, almost 50 years now, that I've worked with Native Canadians in one way or another, just slowly and steadily, I see a kind of peacefulness beginning to emerge. But there cannot be peace without justice. There cannot be peace without justice, and there cannot be justice without sacrificial love. Suffering, long-suffering love. And love means taking other people's interests seriously, even when other people's interests aren't the same as yours. Costly love. That's what it means. Not cheap love. Costly love. Sacrificial love. And that's what is at the heart of this whole thing called healing. So let's get on with some of the real facts. Okay? The real issue around this theme of residential schools and reconciliation between cultures is poverty. Half of the Canadian natives live below the poverty line. 1/2 live below the poverty line. The resources are diminishing. As they become more self-determining, the government uses this excuse for pulling back and providing less resources. The Indian Act makes them ward of the states, totally dependent, a list of who's an Indian. And if you're a male and marry a white person, you remain an Indian. But if you're a woman and marry a white man, you're not an Indian anymore. It's called, and even to call it the Indian Act these days is shameful. The Department of Indian and Northern Affairs, and no one has had the courage to say, that's not the name they call themselves. They were here long before we were. Let's call them what they call themselves. First Nations, Aboriginal Canadians, Native Canadians, but Department of Indian Affairs that control the lives of people who come out of a heritage where they were called savages. We have a long way to go on this path towards healing. And then, of course, there was this poverty has led people to live in shanty towns and live in slums and to live in reserves, little fenced-off areas, and land with people for whom land did not have borders until we decided to put borders and provinces and states and all the rest of it. And part of this was all of this was lack of education, social skills, job training, huge amount of sickness. And because of the residential school situation, a lot of drug problems and alcohol problems, and 15% of this 10% of Canadians, only 10% of Canadians are First Nations, but in our jails, 15% are First Nations. It's a bit of an aside now, and I have to watch for asides because I got to watch time. But I think when we look at things in 200 years from now, one of the issues we'll be looking at is how we treated prisoners and how we misunderstood what caused the criminal mind and how we deal with them. But the main thing that part of the Indian problem is, Prime Minister Trudeau called it, which now call the situation, the reality, the crisis, is the residential schools. And I just wanted to give a bit of background to the situation and the relationship to the church. In 727, a group of people from England came to Nova Scotia as missionaries to try to care for young native children, and saw that education was something that would be really helpful to them because they had no education whatsoever. And of course, it would be education in the English language with English textbooks and English teachers, of course.